club takes pleasure in attracting a stellar list of speakers that address today's most relevant issues. The club's place as a refuge for rich discussion and networking has never wavered after 123 seasons.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
My name is Anita McCuitt, and I'm the president of the Canadian Club of Toronto. A book isn't going to end racism or inequity, but it can be a start. This is a quote from today's guest, Michael Bach, author of Birds of All Feathers. In recent months, the discussion about improving diversity and inclusion in Canadian organizations has reached a fevered pitch, but there's still a lot of confusion about the actual actions that companies can take to make real and lasting change. Michael's book provides direction on creating and rebuilding safe, sustainable, and truly equitable workplaces. And he's here today with some practical advice for all of us. Before we dive into today's topic, here's some information about how you can participate with us. The click here to switch stream button helps if you find that your internet is slow. The video quality may reduce, but the audio should stay strong. Once you click the questions tab, you can enter your questions in the window and they'll be sent directly to our moderator. Thank you today for the generous sponsorship of TD Bank. And thanks to them, today's event is free of charge for all of our viewers. They also provided a copy of Michael's new book to the first 200 participants, and we hope that you're enjoying your copy if you were one of the speedy lucky ones. A quick note about the Canadian Club. As a nonprofit organization, we do have standard operating costs. And so our 2020 season is going to see us transitioning into paid virtual events. We will also be launching an exciting membership program that will offer you access to our events and more. So stay tuned for further details on that. We appreciate your understanding and we're grateful for your support as the club enters its 124th season with a renewed vision in this virtual world. Now to introduce today's speaker. Michael Bach is the founder and CEO of the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. Michael is internationally recognized as a thought leader and subject matter expert in the fields of diversity, inclusion, and employment equity. And we're also proud to call him a former club director. Michael will be joined in conversation today by Jeffrey Orridge, chairman of the Tidal Gaming Group and former commissioner of the CFL from 2015 to 2017. Thank you, Jeffrey, for joining us today for this important conversation. One of the club's traditions that has not changed in this virtual world is that we make a toast to our country. Usually we do it in person with the raising of a glass. If you have a glass nearby, make a nod towards the screen and toast to Canada. To Canada. Michael and Jeffrey, I will turn the Canadian Club podium over to you.
Anita, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Michael, before we get into the book, which I found really fascinating, it was informative, it was insightful, it was entertaining. And as much as it is a how-to book in terms of how to do diversity and inclusion and to really make it work within a company or any organization, I also found it to be a why to book, why it's important. Can you tell me why it was important to you to even write a book like this?
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. I think that's a really good question to start on. I've been working professionally in diversity and inclusion now for 15 years. And honestly, I've found that there are two types of books in my space. Some are very academic, and they're great because they give you a lot of data, but they don't necessarily give you a lot of practical solutions. And the others, no disrespect intended, are written by consultants that are trying to sell their services. And I felt like we were missing something. I felt like we were missing a bit of an instruction guide that small business owners, managers, anybody could pick it up and really get something out of it, and wouldn't have to hire a consultant. They wouldn't have to spend a lot of money. They could read my book and say, okay, I think I have an idea of what I'm doing here, and get started.
Great. So, you mentioned you've been involved in this for more than 15 years, and you are an acknowledged expert in this area, and this is a real business discipline. So despite your credentials, though, have you ever found it a challenge when you walk into a room because you are a white male and ostensibly privileged? Any credibility issues? Do people ever push back and say, how can you possibly relate to diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, that's been something I've faced my entire career in this space. I remember a woman who has become a good friend, and she would look at me and say, how are you working in diversity and inclusion? Because I am a white man and not ostensibly privileged. I am privileged. I grew up in a middle-class household. My parents were still together. They paid for my college education. I mean, I'm sort of carrying around a briefcase of privilege. But it's not to say that I haven't faced my own discrimination in my life. I came out as gay in 1987. When it was not all, will and grace. People from the LGBT community, and particularly gay men, were very much the pariah of society because of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I also live with depression, and I did not come out publicly as living with depression until I was actually 40 years old. And that's largely because of the stigma that is attached to it. So I find myself in this, it's a bit of a dichotomy because I do come in this physical package, but at the same time, I faced my own oppression. So, and I actually find it worse now when people are, I think, more tokenizing D&I practitioners. They're saying, oh, we have to have a person of color. And I think that's great. And we absolutely should have more people of color as D&I practitioners. But that's not about, being a D&I practitioner is not about your lived experience. I'm an advocate for women's advancement. I'm not a woman. I am an anti-racist, but I'm white. It can't be about the lived experience as much as it has to be about advocating for others.
Right, and a knowledge base. And
absolutely.
And a passion for it. It kind of strikes me as when I was commissioner of the CFL, and people would say, well, you're not Canadian and you've never played Canadian football. How can you possibly understand? And my retort was always, I know a number of excellent OBGYNs who have never been pregnant. So I think it is about passion. It's about understanding. It's about creating a knowledge base and an awareness, and honing your skills and really looking for the opportunity to exercise those skills. So
yeah. I would say, Jeffrey, not to cut you off, but I have the ability to use my privilege to the advantage of others. That I can do things that others can't. I can say things that others can't because of my privilege. And I've always said with my team, and I have an incredibly diverse team at CCDI, that my job sometimes, when needed, is to open the door so that they can walk through. And I happily use that privilege to the advantage of others.
So are you saying that because of your complexion and because of your external packaging, you are actually at an advantage when you
Sure.
walk into a room and other people in that room who are typically decision makers feel more simpatico with you or feel they can relate to you better?
Very much so.
Because of
Yeah.
your package?
Yeah. When I walk into a room of men who look like me, they look at me and I kind of diffuse the whole situation because, I've been in many situations where I'm going into a room and there's this kind of, the hackles are up. People are feeling defensive about what's about to happen, particularly if it's, if I'm going in to deliver training, because of course everyone loves to be told that they have to go to diversity training. And I walk in and they look at me like, why is this white guy here? Oh, okay. They listen. And it's not always, that is not always the case. But there have been instances when I walk into a room and because of the package that I'm in, I have the privilege to say and do things and my goal in saying and doing things is to make sure that the next person who walks into the room, who is a woman, who is a person of color, is indigenous, is a person with this disability, will be able to be effective and not face the same backlash that they would prior to my walking through.
Right, great. So let me turn specifically to your book for a second. And for those of you who haven't gotten it, it's Birds of All Feathers, Doing Diversity and Inclusion Right. I want to quote something from it. It says here that diversity and inclusion have become buzzwords. They're used in casual conversation by CEOs and world leaders alike. So, Michael, let me ask you a question. What's changed to cause us to use diversity and inclusion so frequently these days?
I think there's been an awakening. Look at the Prime Minister. Every time he opens his mouth, he says the word diversity. I'm not complaining. It has been very good for business. But I think he's sort of one of the first world leaders that's had this awakening that he made it a priority to ensure that his cabinet was reflective of the country. So he has had gender parity the entire time he's been the prime minister. He has had people from different ethnocultural backgrounds. He's had openly gay ministers. He's had people with disabilities. Carla Qualtrough is visually impaired. He's had people from different religions. He's not doing that because he's a nice guy. He's doing it because he had an incredible cadre of talent to choose from a ministerial perspective. It's not politically correct. It's not ticking a box. But he also had the candidates running as well, because of course you have to have that pipeline for talent. I think people are waking up and realizing that we're in this tsunami of demographic change. And we have no choice but to get on board, lest we end up becoming obsolete as a country and as employers.
Great. I want to get back to that in a minute, Michael, the idea of the demographic shift and the talent pool. But let me ask you another question specific to this. As the words diversity and inclusion become so casually and often so cavalierly sometimes used in our corporate lexicon, is there a danger that the impact or significance is going to be diminished in some way, that it's just a trite phrase and people kind of throw it away?
I don't think so, and here's why. The words do not have power or a lack of power on their own. We give words power. There has been a movement afoot in my profession for a while now around things like, should we say diversity and inclusion? Should we say inclusion and diversity? Should we stop saying diversity? Because some people believe that the word diversity has become either tokenized or polarized or somewhere in between. And I think that is an excuse. Switching the words around is sort of like putting lipstick on a pig and expecting it not to smell. The words don't have the power. We give the words the power. And I look at the word chocolate as an example. So I cannot effectively blame the word chocolate for the size of my posterior. It's clearly the chocolate and my lack of self-control that are the issue. It's not the word. The word doesn't have the power. I think it's important that we still say diversity and inclusion or inclusion diversity, because we have to remember what we are including. Because it is entirely possible to have an inclusive workplace and no diversity. So it's really important that we always remember who we're trying to include as part of this conversation.
Can you explain that a little bit more? What do you mean by you can have a diverse workforce but not an inclusive workforce?
Yeah, so you can have a workforce that is diverse, that is made up of people from different demographic groups. And I'm not talking just about sort of the, different genders and different ethnicities. I'm talking about the complete expanse of diversity. You can have a workforce that is diverse, but that doesn't mean that they feel included. That doesn't mean that they feel like they belong, doesn't mean that they feel engaged. I was working with one client where they had a pretty significant program around attracting people of color to the organization. And it was working well. They had lots of people coming in the front door. And then they saw their voluntary turnover numbers spike. And when they looked at the numbers, they realized what they had was twice as many people of color going out the back door than were coming in the front. And you have to make sure that the environment is a safe space, that it is an inclusive work environment where people are going to feel included. They're going to feel engaged. Because if you hire me into an organization as an openly gay man living with a disability, and I hear homophobic comments and transphobic comments, I'm excluded from events because of my depression. If I hear any of that, I'm gone. I'm not sticking around. Or I start to underperform. I show up for work and don't do my job terribly well. I don't connect. I don't engage. I don't care. The two things cannot be separated. You have to have an inclusive work environment for the diversity to thrive.
Great. So oftentimes diversity is talked about in terms of quotas or misunderstood in terms of quotas. So I have a couple questions. I was recently interviewed on CBC's The National. It was a few weeks ago. And I was asked a very pointed question. And it was, so I'm an employer. If I'm forced to hire a person of color, is that forcing me to lower my standards? How do you respond to a question like that? I remember my answer, but how do you respond?
I find it really interesting, whenever, not always, but when we talk about the hiring of people of color, of women, of people with disabilities, Indigenous people, that's when we start to talk about substandard. We say, if we're forced to hire a woman to this role, we're going to have to lower our standards, or if we're forced to promote a person of color into this role, we have to lower our promotion criteria. But we never say that about white men. Why not? Why are we suddenly having a conversation about ability? Frankly, it's insulting. And you shouldn't lower your standards. I remember one client we were working with, and we looked at their numbers. The demographics were terrible. The women in leadership positions were really bad. And the person we were working with said, we're just going to have to lower our standards in order to increase the number. And I just looked at him and said, why? Why can you not find the women? It's not like women and people of color are hiding. It's not like they're like, oh no, we couldn't possibly take that job. No, they're there. You just have to be more active in seeking them out. But absolutely, you should not, decrease your standard for hiring people. You just have to work harder at making sure you're hiring the best people. Because if you look at the statistics, and I have, if you are an organization, let's say you're a hierarchical organization, law firms, accounting firms, that sort of thing, and the intake is balanced by gender, it's balanced by ethnicity, And then at the top of the house, it's predominantly white male. Statistically speaking, you have not retained the best and the brightest. It's just not possible. So to say that you have to lower your standards is actually not accurate. You have to raise your standards for the white men to make sure that they are at par with the women and people of color.
Okay. So I recall that McKinsey had delivered 3 reports investigating the business case for diversity. And the first was published in 2015 and it was entitled Why Diversity Matters. And then the follow-up on that was in 2018, Delivering Through Diversity. And then most recently in May of this year, Diversity Wins. So in McKinsey's latest analysis, it reaffirms that both gender, ethnic, and cultural diversity in corporate leadership tends to lead towards better business results. And every organization that I've ever been involved in, we were always seeking that competitive advantage. So if the most diverse companies are more likely than ever to outperform the less diverse peers, why do you think that's not happening more? If there's empirical data that says this, if there is a business case to be made for it, and you speak about the business case when you go in to consult with corporations as to why this is important and why it's important to their success.
Yeah, so the reports from McKinsey are a great example, but studies like this have gone back about 30 years, and they have consistently proven the same point. McKinsey's studies, they did them year over year to make sure that it wasn't a blip, and what they found, if I recall the numbers correctly from Delivering Through Diversity, was organizations with more women on their boards or executives outperformed the national average financially by 21% and ethnically diverse by 33%. And those numbers are consistent across years of the study. I can fill a room full of reports that show you the benefit. I think what holds people back is bias, unconscious bias. People simply get these ideas stuck in their heads. Like if you say the sentence, if I have to hire a person of color, I'm going to lower my standards, you have bias. You're making assumptions about people. If you don't know that bias is there, and bias is not just personal, there can be systemic bias, bias in the system, bias in the ways you do things. If you don't know it's there, then you will continue to fall into that trap. And I think that's genuinely it. I don't think people are looking at this seriously. I don't think they understand the complexity of the conversation, and it can be a very complex conversation. And I think at some point hopefully there comes to an awakening where they go, oh, okay, I see how this can solve my problems. And that's why when you look at my book, it's very business focused. It's not a social justice argument. It's very much the business priority. And it's simply because that's what lasts. If we're doing this because it's just about our heart, it's not going to last. But if we do it because we understand it from our head, we understand that this is a business priority, this impacts both top and bottom line, and it can help us in so many ways, then that's what's going to stand the test of time.
So sentiment and doing the right thing is not really enough. It's got to be based on business principles. Correct?
Well, the problem with approaching it from the right thing to do is it assumes we all know what the right thing to do is. It assumes we have this collective sense of right and wrong, of morals and values, and we don't. If we did, we would not need a justice system because no one would commit crime. Arguably, the President of the United States believes that he's doing the right thing and that he has morals and values. They would just probably be misaligned with mine. And I'm not trying to get political. I'm just using that as an example. Whereas if we look at it from the perspective of creativity and innovation and solving problems, that's when it lasts. That's when we go, okay, I can understand that. And we then continue to make it a priority in our organizations.
Well, you mentioned in your book, you call out a distinction between social injustice and creativity and innovation. Can you expand on that? What's the difference, and do they intersect? Do they overlap? Or are they separate and distinct?
Yeah, so if you look at the Oxford Dictionary of Social Justice, it's defined as justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privilege within a society. And that sounds great, but it also sounds like socialism, and that's what it is. And it is impossible to remove self-interest. Essentially, the social justice model of diversity and inclusion, which has been around since the civil rights movement of the 1950s, was about someone losing for someone else to gain. That's very simplistically what it's about. And it requires the people in power, who are predominantly straight, white, able-bodied men, to give up power willingly. It hasn't worked, and I don't think it's going to work. Creativity and innovation is collectively focusing on the solutions to the problems. We are living in a rapidly changing environment, economy, countries. I mean, we're moving at a mile a minute. The data on the planet doubles every 2 years. So we need to focus on solutions. The means to get to those is diversity and inclusion, because we need different people coming up with different ideas. We need that diversity of thought. The way I like to look at it, and understand that I come from a very left-leaning background. My parents were hippies. I was brought up in a social justice environment. And I look at it and say, okay, I'm going to be over here focused on creativity and innovation. The benefit will be the impact on society, the positive impact that we can have on society. Whereas if we focus at it from the other perspective, when we prioritize social justice, that doesn't last. It doesn't impact society in the same way that we want it to.
Okay. So you've developed a roadmap for successful implementation for companies to expand and enhance their talent pool. Can you articulate what that 5-step process is that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, sure. So it starts with a business case. What's the business case for diversity and inclusion in your organization? If you cannot tell me why this matters, then you're dead before you start. You have to be able to articulate very short, 1-page business case. Then you need to do an assessment. You need to understand what the problems are, what you're trying to solve for. Because again, if you don't understand the environment and then obviously where you're trying to go, you're sort of a solution looking for a problem. Then you develop a strategy, and that strategy is meant to address the issues that you identified in the assessment step. And then you execute on the strategy. So what are the initiatives? What are the programs that you're going to roll out? You execute those. And then the last step is measurement. How are you going to measure it? How are you going to figure out if you've been successful? The sixth step, Jeffrey, is rinse and repeat. Because it's not sort of, okay, I go through these 5 steps and I'm done. Because you're going to have something shift and change, and something new is going to come up. And so you need to go back and you need to repeat your assessment. Maybe you need to revisit your business case. You're going to have a new strategy that takes you the next 3 years into the future. You kind of go back and forth on these things because it is an ever-changing and ever-evolving conversation. Put it this way. Up until May 25th, I could not get people in this country to have a conversation about racism, as much as I tried. And then George Floyd was murdered, and now everybody wants to talk about racism. I am not complaining. I am thrilled that we are finally having a conversation about racism in this country. But that was not the case on May 24th. And so I don't know what's coming next. I wish I did. I'd be a very rich man. But we have to be prepared to continue on this journey throughout the future. You never, ever take your foot off the pedal.
Great. So, it's interesting, Michael, because every leadership program that I've attended, and there have been 3 or 4 of them that I've matriculated through, and all kinds of certificates as a result of it. But they've always stressed that that having vision and taking risks and identifying and cultivating talent and constantly exploring ways to gain competitive advantage are some of the hallmarks of great leadership. So how is it that there are so few Blacks, Indigenous people, people of color in decision-making positions and management leadership roles and even board positions, if some of the salient attributes of leadership are to take some risks and to reach out and cultivate that talent pool? Why are Canadian business leaders not necessarily doing that? Or are they?
I think some are. I think largely taking risks is a relative term. And I think that when you look at the decisions being made around sort of boardroom tables, there's not a lot of risk involved. And I think it's a combination of that, and then it's a combination of the pipeline of talent and organizations not paying enough attention to creating an inclusive environment where people can succeed and they stay in the organization, so that when you look to your next line of leadership and you say, okay, who's in line, who's going to be on the infamous high potential list, that it all looks a lot like me, because we haven't been paying enough attention to the people who didn't look like me to make sure that they stuck around, that they had the skills and development. This is work. Diversity and inclusion work is not magical. It will not happen on its own. It requires attention. And, you know, if people are not paying attention today, then we're going to still be having this conversation in 10 years, and boardrooms will continue to look like me.
Right, right. So,
not that there's anything wrong, because I'm really good looking, but still.
So, you know, I've gotten a few questions from the audience. Great. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read these. So, Michael, what can I do to get my company to be more proactive instead of reactive in their D&I strategies and programs?
Mm-hmm. Such a great question. So many organizations are reactive to this. I mean, the number of clients and organizations that called us on May 26th to say, we need to put out a statement. It was overwhelming. My phone lit up like a Christmas tree. How you get through that is, I think, as a starting point, with a really solid business case. Why does this matter? And then doing a bit of an assessment to understand what are some of the problems you're facing. And, you know, you can hire me. I'm a whole lot of fun to work with, but you don't necessarily need to. You have some of the data there just to understand, like, what does your leadership look like? And then what does the available talent look like? And then sort of articulate that business case with the strategy and put it in front of your leaders, and then get them to own it, get them to start to shepherd it through. But it is work, and eventually you're going to have a resource hired who works in diversity and inclusion. This is a job. And somebody has to do the work. You can start with a volunteer council, not a problem, but that will only get you so far. And then you need to have resources, people whose job it is, whose accountability it is to do this work. But start with a business case and doing a bit of an assessment and getting to a point where you can articulate some of the proactive things you can and need to do in order to move this conversation forward.
So I think what I heard you say is that this is a real job, it's a real discipline, and it cannot effectively be done off the side of your desk. It
Correct.
Cannot effectively be done as a bolt-on, as a nice to have, and that belief has to actually be coupled with behavior. So it's nice for a CEO or senior leadership to say, gee, yeah, this is nice and we should put out a statement, but it has to be followed up with some empirical data to build the case, and some real action items that are measurable, because you
Very
can't
much
manage,
so.
don't measure, right?
Absolutely. If you can't measure it, why are you doing it? And
Right.
you're right. Like, we don't hire a general counsel or a chief financial officer and ask them to do it off the side of their desk. This is work. And we need to make sure that we are prioritizing it. If it's actually a business priority, it's time for organizations to put their money where their mouth is.
Great. Let me ask another question that came in from the audience,
Please.
if you don't mind. That is, the D&I conversation has recently moved to focusing on inclusion first, and diversity will follow. Can you once again comment on that theory? I know you touched on it a little earlier.
Yeah, this has been a shift, I think, and I think it's an important shift. We as organizations tended to focus on the diversity first, and then on the inclusion, and I think it's very much should be the other way around. So we need to focus on the inclusion first. You need to cultivate the ground for things to grow, to use a gardening metaphor, I think. If you don't have an environment where people can succeed, then they will leave. So absolutely, you should be focusing on the inclusion first, and then the diversity will follow to some extent. But if it doesn't, then you can be proactive about going and finding it. But if you don't have an environment where women and people of color and people with disabilities and religious minorities and LGBTQ2 plus peoples and so on can succeed, then you will ultimately be failing.
Okay. So you mentioned that diverse candidates may end up leaving. Can you touch a little bit upon how diverse candidates may also be fired, be asked to leave, not set up for success? It has been my experience that oftentimes a Black person's failures are never really questioned. However, their successes are always scrutinized. And there's almost a disproportionate or inverse relationship. Are the mechanisms there? Are there different standards? Are there different lenses that people of color, whether they be women or people of color, are they judged differently? Are they assessed differently?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is a double standard. There are different sets of rules. And that comes back to the cultivation of the environment, to making sure that it is an inclusive workplace where the people that are there already are going to embrace the difference that is coming in, that it is going to be the infamous safe space where, you name it, women, people of color, indigenous people, people with disabilities, etc., can be successful in the environment. It's one thing for your recruiter to go out and, find a Black person for a job and then bring them to an environment where they hear discriminatory comments, or, as many Black women have experienced, they have people touching their hair without asking, or they're being scrutinized unjustly. That's a failure. And you need to make sure that people understand unconscious bias. They understand cultural competence, that they have an understanding of what they need to do in order to create an inclusive work environment, because it's not one person's job. It's everybody's job to create an inclusive work environment.
So, Michael, would you, if there's one thing that a business can do to change their workplace for the better, what would that one thing be? And I'm taking this directly from a question from the audience.
The one thing a business can do? That's a great question. If I had to pick one gun to the head, I would say it's around education. It's around education on the topic of unconscious bias, as an example. Because if you don't understand what your brain is doing, how it is categorizing people, and how that bias is affecting your decision making, then you're not going to succeed, and you're going to fail. If I had to pick one thing, and it tends to be the easy thing, we tend to always go to education, but it's an important piece of the puzzle in making sure that you are educating people so that they understand their role, again, in creating an inclusive work environment. And everyone has power. Every individual has power in some way, shape, or form. Doesn't matter what role you're in, how long you've been there, you have the power to potentially create a really toxic work environment. And it's important that everyone understands that it's not the diversity person's job or the HR person's job, it's everybody's job. And I think education ultimately is the first step towards doing that.
Right. Another question from the audience. How has or will COVID change the way diversity and inclusion works in the workplace?
Yeah, COVID is really, I think COVID has shone a light into some dark corners, and we have seen the disparities. I mean, we're talking now about a she session and how the impact on the employment of women is significant. We're seeing women who are staying home with children to educate them rather than putting them back in schools. This is not a short-term impact. This is long-term. Look at the number of cases. There was a CBC study actually just or article recently about the impact on people of color as it relates to COVID-19 and the coronavirus, and how there's a higher percentage of people from Black communities who are being infected. There's so many things that we could talk about in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on this conversation. And we need to be paying particular focus on this. Look at mental health as an example. People have been alone for a very long time. And as human beings, the vast majority of us need human contact in some way, shape, or form. There's mental health implications. There are implications on long-term employment. It's a very long list. And we need to be paying extra attention to everything we do as an organization. I describe diversity and inclusion as layering over an organization. It shouldn't be a bubble on its own. It should layer over everything the organization does. Yes, it is people, but it's also your suppliers, your real estate, your technology, your marketing, communications. There is an aspect of diversity and inclusion in pretty much everything that an organization does. And when you're looking at how your organization is changing, you need to consider the impacts from a diversity and inclusion perspective to make sure that it is not potentially excluding, alienating, marginalizing people unnecessarily.
Yeah, so if it does disproportionately affect women because of household circumstances, if it disproportionately affects people of color because typically they're the last to be hired and the first to be fired, could it also impact in a positive way, whereas the last decade or so, we've been able to ride an economic wave. And there are many people who've been promoted in senior management based on that wave. And sometimes COVID has actually exposed people who have not been able to adjust and adapt and be innovative and creative and look at things from a different lens and a different perspective and adapt and adjust. It's exposing some of those people, and from what I hear, there may be turnover as a result of COVID. Does that necessarily allow for greater opportunity for women for people of color, or is it just reshuffling the deck? Are they going to turn some people and replace them with similar people?
Yeah, that's the ultimate question, Jeffrey. You know, does it just reshuffle the deck? I think it does present potential opportunity, as long as the employer is thinking about it. If they're making changes, if they're potentially letting go of people who have not been able to adjust to this new normal, or that have, you know, sort of, it's been revealed that they are not able to produce in the same way, then if the employer looks at their, you know, their infamous high potential list, I say it again, and it's all white guys, then absolutely nothing changes. They need to be thinking about it. They need to be consciously looking at the available talent. It's not all bad that's come from COVID-19. One of the examples is around flexible work. People with disabilities and women have been asking for decades for more flexibility in work. And for so long, the number of excuses was lengthy. Oh no, we can't do that. We have to have FaceTime, blah, blah, blah. Apparently we don't. And we proved overnight that we could do virtual work. This is going to benefit women and people with disabilities if their employers are able to keep this up. And there are some employers that are actually focusing and saying, yeah, you know what? Apparently you can work from anywhere. So go do your work, which is great. If you're forcing people back to work because that's what you always did and that's what you understand, you're going to end up back where you are.
Okay. So, interesting question. What would you say to someone that is company leadership who sees D&I initiatives and discussions as being too political?
You know, I'd say that in itself is political. You know, everything is political. Every moment in life can be potentially political. This isn't about politics for me. I'm politically agnostic. I think all politicians are full of it. And I just said that on air. For me, this is about how do we get the most out of people? How do we, you know, benefit from society? I'll give you an example. Newcomers. Canada brings in a non-COVID year, 350-ish thousand newcomers per year. 60% of those come in the economic class. 40% come in refugees and family reunification. So we're bringing in people with a lot of skills and experience. And those people struggle to find jobs in their chosen profession. They tend to work in survival positions. They drive for Uber. They are working in hotels, cleaning bathrooms, you know. And I look at I ran some numbers for a project once. And if you brought in a neurosurgeon who ends up in a survival job, their average income is going to be about $27,000. They put $4,000 into the tax system, so they pay about $4,000 in taxes. If they're allowed to be a neurosurgeon, their average income would be about $350,000, and their taxes would be about $42,000. So they are contributing 10 times the tax into the system. That means that we as a society have more money to pay for roads and schools and healthcare. It's not about me being a nice guy. It's me seeing waste and understanding that we need to, the best thing that we can do for our country, for our organizations, is to make sure that we are taking advantage of the talent that's there. This isn't about politics. Politics can do what politics does. This is about looking at the representation in this country. And when you look at the representation of this country, and I wrote about this in the book, about 30% of the population would identify as straight, white, able-bodied, and male, 30% of the working age population. So if you look across at your workforce and it's not 30%, if it's more than 30%, that's when you have to stop and say, okay, why? And there may be mitigating circumstances, absolutely. Nursing, 92% of nursing degrees go to women, 25% of engineering degrees go to women. Right there, got a big disparity. You just look at those numbers and say, what's missing? What's the problem? That's not political. That's just good math.
Right. So, how can leaders untangle and navigate the deep and valid emotions about the news headlines from the creativity and innovation opportunity of D&I? And a follow-on question that I have, is there also a risk of D&I fatigue? Will people get tired of hearing about this and just kind of shut down and shut off?
Yeah. So to the first question, it is the past few months have been very emotional. You don't watch the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd's life and not, I mean, you're basically a sociopath if you didn't find that just crushing. It's really hard to take the emotion out of it. I think it's important to work through those emotions, to acknowledge them, and then get down to work. And you cannot continually live in that emotionally heightened state and be effective from a diversity and inclusion perspective. I'm not saying we shouldn't be emotional. We need to process those emotions. We need to create space where people can express those emotions. But then we need to get down to business. In terms of diversity fatigue, absolutely, that is a possibility. And it happens. I've seen it happen. I think the place where I've seen it, I wrote about it in the book, but I've certainly had a lot of time to think about it subsequently. The place where I see diversity fatigue happening most is when we're not seeing progress. Is when, we've been at this for 5 years and the leadership still looks the same, or the high potential list still looks the same. We're not seeing things being delivered and change happening. And we need to pay very, very close attention to that, because then all of the communications, all of the initiatives, all the efforts around D&I just start to become noise, and we start to tune it out. And we get into quite a bitter place. We're like, it's never going to change here. It's never going to change. And as such, people vote with their feet and they leave. So we need to have sustained action and see the change in order to avoid that.
Right. It reminds me of a phrase that an old boss of mine said: insight without action breeds cynicism.
Yes.
And that sounds about right. Michael, I think we are just about running out of time. I just have one final question for you from after reading your book, and that is, if there's one thing that you could change about this book, is there anything? Is there anything that you've learned recently since the publication of this book that you would want to add or adjust as a result?
Yeah, I wrote the book before George Floyd was killed. So, that has really been a game changer. And not to say that George Floyd is the first person of color to be, oppressed by police, and there's been so many. Canada's had our own versions of that. I think I would put more focus on the ethnocultural, the racism conversation, which I think is sort of the elephant in the room that we as Canadians have not wanted to talk about. This country has a long history of racism, residential schools, among other things. And I would probably apply more of a focus on dealing with the elephant in the room. Because I think until we deal with the elephant in the room, we're not going to get very far.
Great, great. Thank you. Anita, I think this is over to you. Thank you, Michael. It was, you gave me even more insight after reading the book, and I'm going to go back and reread it as a result of this conversation. But I thought it was terrific, and thanks again for your insight and your candor, because I think we've asked a couple fairly provocative questions here, and thanks for being so forthcoming with your answers.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Michael and Jeffrey, for your insights and thoughtful counsel, Michael, on a topic that's still new and frankly confounding for a lot of people. They know they need to do something, they just don't even know where to start. I particularly liked your tip around starting with a business case and understanding why and then going from there. And thanks also for clarifying why it's important to start with inclusion first and then the diversity will follow. Thank you again to TD Bank for their generous support and making today's event free for all. We hope that you can join us at some of our upcoming events. On September 15th, we're hosting a panel on reversing the she session, and it's something Michael alluded to. And we're going to talk about rebuilding the Canadian economy. And then on September 17th, we'll host the Honorable Vic Fedeli, Minister of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade, for a discussion on Ontario's road to recovery. Thank you to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications, and livemeeting.ca for making it possible for us to come together virtually today. Guests, thank you for joining us. Stay healthy and safe.
You too. Thank you.